Welcome to Turning Pages, a series of in-depth conversations with authors about their works.
All right, well, the Rehearsal Club, two stories in one, two authors for one book out through House of Anansi. Laurie, Petrou, and Kate Fodor join me on the program. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Now, occasionally when I've interviewed a pair of authors, it's, for maybe a graphic novel or a children's book where there's an illustrator. But this is a book where it's all words and there's two authors. So I'm very curious about kind of the breakdown of labor, or how a book like this comes together with two authors. Because it's obvious when it's an illustrator and a writer that, whose job is what. But how did you figure out whose job was what?
We didn't.
We both have the same jobs. So, I mean, that's the question we probably get asked the most is how we did it, and how we, like if we took turns writing chapters, or how we split the work. But neither of us having done it before, we didn't know any better or worse. So we just tackled it the way we could, which was we'd meet and on Zoom, because we wrote it predominantly during COVID. And we'd outline each chapter in extreme detail. This is what's going to happen, and this is how it's going to start, and basically who's going to say what and what's going to happen and how it's going to end. And then
that was, can I jump in for a second? Hi, sorry. This is how we did it. We interrupted each other. Just to say that outlining process isn't something that either one of us really does on our own when we're writing. That was something that we came up with because we had to have this sort of external brain, because we were both doing the same work. So we had to really know that we were sort of, to use the expression, on the same page about really everything. So we outlined in a way that was not necessarily familiar to either of us for this kind of work. But I think that was sort of the key to the whole thing.
It was. I don't think we set out with that in mind. That just ended up being how it really, really worked best. And then one of us would, take a go at it, start writing whatever they could using that, like those instructions. And then we would just send it back and forth. And we would revise and send back another. We have so many emails. If I ever did a search, it'd be like back to you, back to you, back to you, back to you of a chapter, until then we would get together again and go through any kind of sticky wickets that we had with, plot stuff, or, can we change this expression? I don't know if I want to, and here's why I think we should, and that kind of thing, until we were happy and ready to move on to the next one.
It sounds like you're talking about negotiation.
Yeah.
And I'm very curious because, a lot of times that negotiation point comes with an editor after you've done a draft, right? If you're an author, does this force you, like, are you essentially like your own editor to start, or are you acting as each other's editor?
I think to some degree that's true. I think, the overall feeling of working together was much more like pulling each other along. Do you know what I mean? Especially in the dark days of COVID, it was the feeling of the relationship was much more sort of, we can do this. This might not be a time when it's easy to do anything alone, but we can do this together. So that was sort of, for lack of a better word, the vibe of the whole thing. But I think, there is a built-in editing process when you have two sets of eyes that maybe is a little more demanding or more careful when it's only your one set of exhausted eyes looking at the thing that you've already looked at 15 times,
But I think Kate's right. Like, I mean, what was baked into that was more of a checks and balance. That was like, okay, is this good? Is this working? Is this good? Yeah, this is good. To have someone else tell you, yeah, this is working, yeah, this is good, is something you don't have when you're writing by yourself. Writing is such a solitary thing usually, and sometimes you get as far as 30 pages and think, this is horrible, I'm going to throw the whole thing away. But with each other, we get to 30 pages and 50 pages and 80 pages and feel like, okay, it's still working. We had someone else to say that to us.
Right. And if you wanted to throw it away, the other person would say, don't you dare.
Yeah.
You're each other's guardrail in some sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And cheerleader, I think.
All of
And
it.
also it was a mystery, right? So like, and mysteries are hard to write. Like we had to, like, there were days where we were just like, my head is pounding. I can't figure this out. If we do this and this isn't going to work. And how do we kind of reverse engineer this? And, um, you know, we had to really figure out the plot of it as well as the writing of it. So it was nice to have someone to sort of puzzle that out with.
Mm.
So is that something you map out together before you actually start writing the narrative? Like, are you thinking mechanics and plot points and the mystery and how you solve it before you actually have the characters go through it?
I mean, I didn't.
Well, I mean, in the sense that we did all that outlining. So before we were sort of looking at the at all the bells and whistles and the description and the dialogue and that sort of stuff, we definitely had outlined.
But I would say that even when the draft was done, we'd be like, okay, like this mystery, this something kind of, this is too obvious, or this isn't obvious enough, or we need another kind of mystery to pull through. And so yeah, I mean, I think that we fell in love with Pal, our main character, and she was more real to us than any mystery before anything else. And yes, as we started working chapter by chapter, then we had to figure out the mystery as we went along. But to know the mechanics of something before the characters come alive is foreign to me. The characters have to be really alive to me first.
So you're starting with your protagonist.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
And the setting, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we really started with the setting, actually.
Yeah.
We learned about the real life rehearsal club, and we just felt like there is something here. Like we gotta do something with this. And that was really where it started, that was the spark.
Yeah, Kate, you mentioned Cynthia Darlow in the acknowledgments as the actress who introduced you the real life rehearsal club. Maybe you can tell me about kind of what happened there.
Yeah, so Cynthia is a wonderful actress. She was on the television series The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel when I was a writer on the show, and we had also done a play together years before. So we were friends, and I was so excited to see her on that set. And she mentioned to me one day that she had become very involved with a new iteration of the rehearsal club. So in our book, for simplicity's sake, the rehearsal club opens and is what it is for decades. In reality, it had a number of iterations. It moved homes once, it closed down for a long time. But right now, there's this sort of new iteration of it that has come about in large part through efforts of some of the women who lived there when they were young, including Cynthia, who's sort of opened a modern version of it that's it's much more open to different kinds of theater artists, directors, choreographers, librettists, now that women do all those things, playwrights, and it's apartments instead of a big old rambling brownstone like it used to be. But there's been this incredible effort to reopen the rehearsal club for a new generation of women. So she was just telling me about that as part of her, what have you been up to lately? Update. And then I got sort of obsessed with the rehearsal club and started reading about it. And because I wasn't a novelist, I think I said to Laurie, there's this place, you should read about it. You should write a book about it, and then she sort of eventually said, well, I'll do it if you'll do it. But that was where it started, was with Cynthia, whose work as an actress is amazing, but also she's just given so much to this effort of making sure that this generation of women has that same support.
So she tells you about a real life thing. You're like, oh, there should be a story about this. You tell Laurie, and Laurie's like, I'm only going to do it if you're going to do it with me.
Well, we'd become friends. Then COVID hit, and we wanted to collaborate together because we felt like we had the same sensibility. We felt a kinship, a creative kinship, and a friendship. And we started actually writing a film together. And then this rehearsal club idea just kind of kept tugging at us. And we kind of played around with what that could look like, and whether it was a film or whether it was older girls or whatever it was. And because of the nature of COVID, and because our kids were younger at the time, and just how much we wanted comfort at that time, we realized that we wanted to write something that was comfy and cozy, and the kinds of books that we read when we were young girls and the kinds of books that we read our kids when they were younger. And I think that kind of it was sort of a perfect storm of the kind of comfort that we needed, the kind of creative satisfaction that we wanted, the collaboration that we knew we wanted to do, and then the setting that presented itself. So yeah, I mean, I definitely wanted to keep working on something with Kate, and it was becoming a distraction, and I wanted to, this is something that we wanted to do more than what we were already working on. So it won.
So this is told in two eras, and I'm curious about, like obviously that helps in terms of the mystery and how they kind of tie together, but it allows you to kind of have essentially two central characters.
Mm-hmm.
Was that something that was there from the start when you were kind of mapping things out, or did that come about as like a problem that you solved, or like how did you kind of figure that out?
It was the problem that we solved. And the problem that it was not what you might initially think of, which is that, historically in the 1950s, not that we are historians or scholars, but in our own research, when we would look at pictures and read accounts of the Rehearsal Club, in the setting that seemed like the most fun to us, which was the sort of 1950s era that half our book is now set in, there was only really one kind of young woman living in the Rehearsal Club in the 1950s. There was not ethnic diversity. There was some financial diversity, but it was a place for sort of young white women. And we didn't want to write a book that was full of just white people. And we knew that that book wouldn't be received well by publishers, that they're looking for books that are welcoming and diverse and can reach a lot of different audiences. So we had to struggle with, what do we do? Do we pretend that it wasn't the way that it was? Do we just, make it diverse even though it wasn't? Is that a lie? Is that, washing over something that that's a truth that needs to be acknowledged? So we were a little bit stuck with that. And then we realized if we did it this way, it gave us a whole half of the novel to use to introduce a vibrant, diverse, modern group of friends living in a time when people's lives aren't so stratified.
You mentioned Pal. You started kind of with Pal as the character that you started with. What was it about Pal? Like, did you have discussions about kind of like who you wanted them to be, what you saw them as, like what kind of spirit they brought to things?
Yeah, we wanted her to be kind of unapologetically funny, because funny girls don't get a lot of airtime or page time. And we liked the idea that she was, kind of in the peripheral of the Rehearsal Club. So she, at one point says like, I don't want to be an actress. And, and the house mother says, well, have you heard of Carol Burnett? And introduces her to Carol Burnett, who had been a resident at the Rehearsal Club and is sort of the quintessential funny girl. And so we wanted her to be unapologetically funny. We wanted her to be flawed, which she is. She kind of gets in her own way. She makes mistakes and she has to cope with them. And we wanted her to be sort of in that in-between age where she's kind of figuring herself out. She's trying to be part of the grown-up world, but often steps in it. She's got an older sister who she really idolizes, but she can't quite find a rhythm of being the same, being a friend with her, because they're not the same age. So there were a lot of elements about Pal that endeared her to us, a lot of characteristics that I think, we both identified with, and that we wanted to see that kind of character on the page. We didn't just want to have some young woman who wanted to be a Broadway star and, lived for the theater. We wanted there to be those people in the book, but our main girl is not who we would call her our girl. We often, even now, as we're working on our next book, we call our characters our girl. OG, before they have a name. And our girl was always this kind of funny, scrappy, clumsy, flawed character.
So does the character then help inform like the plot mechanics? Like, do you find that like it has to be true to like what she would do in order to get you where you need to go?
Well, sure. I mean, Pal gets up and sneaks out in the middle of the night because she would. Other characters wouldn't. So you kind of have to allow your I think it works. I mean, Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, you feel the same way, but like, you know, they both open themselves up to each other. The plot opens itself up to the character kind of moves with the plot at the same time. Like, what would your character do? You know, it's not the same as what all the other characters would do. So yeah, her personality allowed us to create certain plot things, but we had to stay true to who she was and who Olive was. Like, what would Olive do in certain circumstances? Would she wait by the phone for a message? What would she do when she was nervous or anxious? You know?
So do you ever like discussions about certain things not fitting with what your character would do? Like, did you ever debate, you know, is this true to Olive or is this true to Pal? Like, would they have done this? Or did you just inherently know these are the things that work with them or that they would do?
You know, I think it's a little bit, I mean, forgive me because this is a little bit of a cliched way of looking at it, but it's also really true to me is, you know, it's like playing music, right? Like, you know, if you're composing music, if you're, you know, maybe there are some things that you can say, does this work better? Does this work better? But if there's a note that's just wrong, right? Like if there's a note that's just sharp or flat, or, you know, you both kind of go, "Ooh, yikes, not that." Um, so, so I think that, you know, a lot of it is almost without being discussed or almost without being said, that you just sort of, I'm not musical enough to follow through with my own analogy, but you know that you sort of, you're playing it by ear, and you hear it when it works, and you hear it, you both hear it when something's off.
A
And
discordant
just
note is obvious.
Yeah.
Yes,
And just to
exactly.
add to that, like, I mean, we basically had three main characters because we had Olive written as a young woman and then Olive as an older woman. And so, you know, we had to be true to who Olive became, you know, who she
Mm.
was when she was young. And then she becomes this, you know, grand dame of Broadway. And how did she conduct herself when she was an older woman versus how she conducted herself when she was young? So to have a character who's changed and have, you know, write them so that they're true to the different stages of themselves was important to us. But I think that we just fell in love and got to know our characters so well that yeah, it became instinctual, that we would know it when it was right and know it when it was wrong, and that was not a hard thing for us to figure out.
It's funny.
But that really was a fun thing, you know, to be clear, Olive is a character who appears in both sections of the book. So you meet her as a young woman in the 1950s, and then you meet her as a grande dame in the present day. And that really was fun and something that I hadn't done before, because you're both making sure that it's always Olive, right? Like that it's always our girl Olive, and feels true to her, but also she's changed enormously over the decades and gained a huge amount of confidence, and you know, so writing somebody who's a whole new person and yet you can feel is also the same person, um, was really fun and interesting.
Mhm. And having her own up to her own mistakes, the way that we see Pal, you know, own up to hers, was nice because, you know, she comes to grips with things that she had done when she was younger that, you know, Pal uncovers and that Olive has to atone for or admit to, um, come to grips with, which is nice.
I'm glad that you've mentioned that there is an older Olive because I was dancing around kind of like whether that was a like secret within the book that we were supposed to
Oh,
kind of
If it was, I
keep
put my foot.
keep as a plot point. But it is interesting that you said, you know, like having to imagine what she becomes later on, and then essentially that's a different character for you to write. But that forgiveness is kind of like core to this book at all points, whether it's the 50s or the contemporary setting, and that there are no bad people. There are people who like make bad choices or do bad things, and owning that is the important thing, and that both central characters have to kind of reckon with that. And
thank you for observing that.
you're welcome. I'm curious about like was that like do you talk about messaging or like you know what you want to get at when especially because this is pitched to young adult readers that like a lot of times there is like a central message or like something that you want to address as either a social issue or a learning point.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, in a way, you know, when you're writing characters, one of the things that you're always thinking about is how do they change, right? Like it's not interesting to have a character who doesn't change over the course of their story. And so it was sort of, once we had this sense that, we always knew that we wanted this to be a very warm and heartening book, and so once we had the sense that that was the tone of it, I think the answer to the question, how do people change? One of the most clear cut, obvious routes to take is they begin to be able to see themselves and their own choices and decisions more clearly, and they sort of come to know themselves. And I think that that's something that happens to almost everybody over the course of this book, and that's where a lot of the sort of forgiveness of oneself, forgiveness of other people, sort of fit very naturally as a theme. And this sort of idea of forgiveness as forgiveness doesn't mean you never did what you did. Forgiveness doesn't mean there isn't ground that needs to be made up. Forgiveness doesn't mean, that you're off scot-free, but it does. There's always the potential for people to learn from their mistakes and sort of come back to themselves in this book.
And I think we had them, and if I reflect back on some of the moments when our characters kind of had these, moments where they realized something about themselves, it was usually an interaction with another character. It was either through learning about their own experience, or, when Pal has conversations with her sister, or, being really, defensive. I remember being such a defensive young person, and then sort of realizing and becoming embarrassed at my own, because I was proud, and there are moments of interaction with the characters where it's the other character that helps reveal something to them about themselves. I would also like to say that, like, our editor, Emma at Groundwood, did a really good job of saying, okay, like, I see this relationship between Pal and Naomi. I'd really like to see more of this. And she would, in our first sort of main structural edits, helped bring things like forgiveness or some of those more nuanced relationship things out of us more. So it helped us to sort of dial certain scenes up, or just sort of raise the stakes in certain ways. And that helped highlight the relationships between the characters.
One of the things that I really like too is that it's not just the kids learning from the adults, that there are cases in this book of adults learning from young people, which was important to us too.
The young people, the age at which, like Olive's youth is portrayed, or the age Pal is in her story, like, because obviously these are tumultuous times in which, you're growing up, you're kind of finding your identity. How important was it to pitch it at like those points, so that they're like not on a firm ground as to who they are?
That's an interesting.
Yeah. How important was it?
Yeah, like did you talk about like they should be this age because, developmentally, like, they're not necessarily set in their ways. They're still figuring out who they are, and like Pal is trying to figure out like what's her role.
I mean, we debated whether she was 11 or 12. Like, I felt like right up into the very end.
But I don't think it was, again, I think we weren't that sort of clinical or organized about it. I mean, I think probably we automatically honed in on these ages, for Pal being a preteen, and for Posey being a late teen, because they are ages, and we remember, maybe particularly for girls, I don't know, but we remember those as being such sort of fraught but beautiful times. I think we probably sort of honed in on them automatically, but I don't remember having a conversation where we sort of specifically said, if you think about human development, these are the interesting, points. I think it was more, like a lot of stuff, more instinctual than that.
But also plotty too. Like, okay, so we've got a kid. She has to be old enough to be able to run around New York by herself. She just got a phone. How old would she be? But we don't want her so old that, like, isn't excited or curious or, still wants to, do dumb stuff with her friends and sing dumb songs and be kind of embarrassed, or not embarrassed. So I think some of that stuff was like, it might have come out organically in our conversations about like how.
And, to be perfectly honest, I'm going to just completely contradict myself now, because I think once we started writing, it was more instinctual, but there were some early conversations about, YA fiction, so fiction for high schoolers, that group of readers is pretty sophisticated, and they tend to want, a little bit of sex, a little bit of violence, maybe some vampires, and this rehearsal club idea had a kind of innocence to it, sort of baked into it, that I think we sort of knew and discussed wasn't going to fly for, a 40-year-old might be interested in reading about the rehearsal club, and a 12-year-old might be interested in reading about the rehearsal club. It was hard to imagine an 18-year-old or a 17-year-old being drawn to that subject matter. So there was some sort of conscious, we don't want this to be a YA novel like The Hunger Club. It's not going to fit in there. It's not going to compete there. It's for younger kids. And given that, how do we make the story work, considering that the young women who were living at the rehearsal club were maybe 17 at the very youngest. So we did have, there was some finagling there.
It was, because it was like, what does the readership look like if you've got two plot lines and some of them are like late teens, maybe even early 20s? How do you aim this towards a readership that's very young? I mean, and I remember very, very early days, because I have books about it, like getting books out on the Barbizon, which was a sort of a similar little more upscale boarding house for young women, around the same time. And that would have been a completely different book. Writing about the Barbizon, or even writing about the rehearsal club with just those women who were living in it in mind. Introducing Pal as our protagonist and seeing the world through her eyes really geared our readership young and younger. We had a author talk last week at a school with a bunch of kids who were 9 to 12 years old, and it just confirmed that it's the right age, and what a great age, and how innocent and whimsical and all in, like big readers, really engaged and curious, and they would have talked to us all day and we would have talked to them all day. It was just the most heartwarming, wonderful experience.
Well, it makes sense
they're so smart, but they're still kids. Yeah. Sorry, interrupting.
No, I was gonna say it makes sense to pitch it to because Pal sees her older sister, and it's like that aspirational, like, oh, they're so cool, I want to do what they do kind of vibe. You get that from as a reader, right? That like, oh, this sounds interesting. This sounds like something I would want to do, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, the Rehearsal Club out now, and Laurie, Petrou, and Kate Fodor, thank you very much for taking some time to talk about it. Strongly recommend it. I'm reading the Series of Unfortunate Events to my youngest right now, and I feel like this would kind of fit in that same sort of like pitched tone of like wonder and enjoyment, and the world is a mystery. So I look forward to reading it to them.
Oh, I hope we enjoy it. Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.